there a writing craft book on your bedside table? Has it been there for a while?
Do you keep meaning to get past chapter 2, or chapter 1, or just the first page?
Then the Words to Write By podcast is for you. Hi, I'm Renee. I teach composition and creative writing to college students. My background is in poetry, but I'm working on my memoir.
And I'm Kim. I'm trained as a science journalist, but now I'm trying my hand at short fiction. Each week we'll be tackling a chapter of some well-known, but perhaps not so well-read, writing craft book.
Together, we'll uncover brilliant insights, face the hard truths, and totally disagree when the author is wrong.
This is our podcast, after all.
And then, we're going to take what we learn and apply it to our own writing.
By doing the book's suggested exercises.
We're inviting you to read along, or just tune in for the Cliff Notes version.
We're committed to improving our own craft, one writing advice book at a time, and we'd love for you to join us. This week, Renee did something different. She went on the subreddit Writing and did an AMA, an Ask Me Anything. And I was looking at it, and she got 77 comments.
I didn't. Most of those were mine.
Half of probably yours. But still, before we start our podcast, I was curious, Renee, what was the experience like doing the AMA?
It does take like all day, and people trickled in. I had a lot of anxiety. I was afraid I was going to get some trolls and like death threats and weird stuff, but it didn't happen. So it was okay.
I didn't notice when I scrolled to the bottom that there was one person whose comments had been removed by the moderator.
Yeah, he wasn't making a lot of sense. He didn't really have a question. It's like he wanted to just say something. And one of the things he did is he was questioning my background and authority.
Mm-hmm.
I ignored him. Somebody else, though, responded and said, well, if you go to the About page on her podcast, which is linked to the thing, you'd find this out. And then he just started talking about kids these days. And I'm like, okay, this guy. And I actually, I just keep saying he, they. It could have been a woman. You never know. Could have been a 12-year-old. You never know. So she was complaining about Gen Z or millennials. And I was like, okay, now.
So what surprised you most about the experience?
I think I was a little surprised by people asking me whether or not I thought the MFA was quote unquote worth it for them because it's such a personal choice. But I think what they needed was somebody to like help make their decision. And that's not necessarily why I was on there, but that was interesting. I wasn't expecting a lot of that. I became more of like a counselor in that sense.
Well, of the things you listed, it was the most relevant to the people on the writing subreddit.
But yeah, I thought maybe they would ask more about like what happens after the MFA.
Uh-huh.
But if you haven't finished it yet, I guess you're thinking more about whether you should do it or not. So.
Yep. That's probably the people that are hanging out there on that thread.
Yeah.
Would you do it again?
Maybe if the question was different or if I was on there like talking about podcasting, I think I would totally do it. Or if it was specific to what people learn when they go get an MFA.
I thought you were really gracious in your responses. You seemed to like really focus in on what the person asked and answered it to your best of your ability. And it seemed like a lot of people responded thanking you too.
Yeah, people were cool. They had genuine questions and I had genuine answers. That's the best part about teaching.
Do a lot of subreddits have their own AMA?
I wouldn't say most subreddits, there's thousands of them, but the ones that invite discussion and include some kind of expertise and advice, yeah, totally.
So would you recommend it?
Doing one?
Yeah.
Yeah. If the subreddit is full of advice or the same questions get brought up over and over again and they never seem to get fully answered, and if you're an expert, I think that is a really good resource for people. Because people who don't have experience can't tell the difference between good advice or bad advice or what's real and what's not real. So having an authority on there is kind of nice to set the record straight. I appreciate it. I mean, I just read one recently about someone doing ultra running. I super appreciated that one.
Okay. That was your good deed for the week, I suppose.
My good deed for the week, yes.
And with that, let's go on to the podcast. So if you've gotten bored with scenes, do we have a treat for you? In this episode, we're tackling Chapter 7 of Scene and Structure, which introduces the sequel. What is a sequel? And what is in a sequel? And is this idea of Bickham's a real thing they use in real books? And in the midst of all these questions, Renee has an existential crisis. Don't worry, she gets better. We've got a lot to cover in this episode.
All right, so this chapter,
we're changing gears a little bit. It's been scene, and now there's something else.
There is something else, and boy, is it something big. This chapter 7, is called Linking Your Scenes, the Structure of Sequel. So what the heck is a sequel?
I actually have some thoughts on that. He talks about two structural components, the first being transitions, which is just basically, and at this other place, this was happening. It's basically that little square that you have in your comic books whenever you switch from one place to another and say,
right,
back at the X-Men mansion.
Right. Next Thursday.
Exactly. Meanwhile.
Yeah.
So those are the transitions, but then we have sequels. Do you want to give us a definition?
The sequel is the glue that holds scenes together and helps you get from one point to the next. It's in-depth characterization, analysis of motivation, explanation of character, and planning, etc.
Etc. That etc. is, I think, it's a catch-all. It's like everything in your book that's not a scene.
But he has a very structured way. Well, not only does he have a structured way of telling us, because he is the bullet point king, but he's got a very rigid set of things that you should be doing in between your scenes.
He claims he has a very rigid set, but he also basically says that the sequel can contain some, but maybe not all of these things he discusses. And my issue is, I think he wanted something to balance the scene, and so he basically threw everything else into this thing called a sequel.
So what is a sequel? Say you've written your scene, dear writer, and the scene is now over. The dialogue is ended. The disaster has taken place. What happens next in your story? Well, it could be another scene, but most likely it will be something else. It will be glue, as Bickham says, that connects the scenes together. It's the stuff in the middle, and it's characterization, description. It helps get into the character's thoughts, all of these things that don't happen on stage. Like he said in a previous chapter, where a scene has to happen on stage. So a lot of this stuff is internal. Some of it can be action, but most of it is internal.
We often use TV shows or movies to substitute in for examples when we're talking here, because people have seen these things. Everyone knows about them. And when you're watching a TV show, it's one scene after another after another. It's actually kind of odd when you have a voiceover or something in between that would link the way a novel is. Often people will say, well, there's this really incredible book, but I don't see how they'll possibly turn it into a movie because there's so much internalization. So in this case, movies and TV shows and probably plays don't use sequels, or rarely use sequels. This is something special to the novel.
I would say if there are sequels in a movie, it's a slow movie. There's a lot of pausing, and you just kind of have to be like, okay, that action is metaphorical.
I look at his definition. I'm not 100% sold on what he's saying, but I do recognize that the power in writing a novel is this ability to do the internalization. All the things he discusses in here are really critical parts to a novel and really powerful parts to a novel. I'm not sure if all these parts aren't just independent by themselves.
So Bickham's theory is that your character finishes the scene, the disaster takes place, and then they have an emotional reaction. Here's like the basic parts of a sequel, the stuff in between your scenes. There's 4 stages. There's emotion, thought, decision, and action.
I find this replicates exactly what we mentally do as humans. We have an emotional response, we think about it, we reformulate our goal, and we go forward, and then we go to action. So it's a very natural progression. I totally buy that that's the natural reactions a person would have after a scene. But then when he's discussing them, sometimes he'll say, we start with an emotional reaction, and then you go to analysis, and then back to the emotional reaction. Maybe you skip the goal and go to action. It feels like all these individual parts are important, but maybe they're there, maybe they're not.
Right. How necessary are they?
I think they're necessary depending on you as the writer and the sort of story you're telling. But when you're working on scene, I really could see learning how to put all those pieces together. And this, it feels, I think it's going to be useful, but I don't think I'll make note cards to define what my sequel is.
Okay, so from my perspective, I've actually had this question genuinely as a writer. What goes in between scenes? There's so much focused on scenes. I mean, if you go on Scribed, I think it is, or other novel writing software, they've designed it so that each like square or post-it on there is a scene. And I know a novel is more than just a scene, right? There's other stuff. There's meat in there that can't be described as a scene. And it has actually, as a writer, always perplexed me about what goes in there. Why does it go in there when? What are the internal workings?
Another support to this idea you have is that whenever you're in a critique group, one of the most common feedback someone will get is, you've given this great scene, but I don't see any emotional reaction from the character. I don't see how it moves them forward. I need to get more. If you simply give a person a scene and then jump to the next scene, there's something missing for the reader.
Right. And in memoir workshops, you'll commonly hear people say after like a big scene, well, how did you feel? And you're like, well, how do I describe my feelings besides actually describing feelings, which is a really bad idea in good writing anyway. I felt sad. Probably not a good idea. Anyway, regardless of whether or not these things are in a sequel, this is how Bickham breaks it down. You can show emotion in 3 ways. You can describe it, like I was sad. You could give an example, like throwing a tantrum, or your character could be very angry and throwing things around the room.
Some kind of externalization of what's going on inside. And this is stuff that TV shows and stuff will do. You'll see the actor communicating through their actions what's going on in their head.
And in a screenplay, you definitely have to do that. Everything is external. Then this one was interesting. Discussion. Sometimes characters will talk about their feelings.
Or talk about a situation or reinterpret it. It's especially important if you've got somebody that isn't naturally very introspective.
Right.
That you force it out of them.
So if they're having a conversation, though, isn't that a scene?
That's what I was noticing. In his description of what a sequel is, once you get too much in the moment, once you start bringing externalization, it almost starts to feel like a scene. But maybe this is his way of dealing with those conversations in a story where you don't have antagonists. Because at some point in your story, you have to have 2 people together doing something, and they're not necessarily going to be antagonistic. So maybe this is his way of saying, okay, all those conversations that don't fit a evolving conflict, well, they're part of this other thing.
All of these like very specific rules, it bothers me because it seems as if there's no room for there to be a variation, even though he's got a section in here on the variation of it. Like the fact that he says discussion, but that he just went to town on scenes in the previous chapters, it just confuses me.
Yeah, for Bickham, his scenes contain a conflict, and so any conversation in a scene needs to be furthering that conflict. Even his idea of a scene is that a scene always ends in a disaster. Well, what about those conversations that are part of the story where they don't end in a disaster? Well, I guess they're part of the sequel then.
I wish he would have made that point. I'm going to adopt that because that would explain to me why some scenes don't really have conflict.
When you need to get more information out to the audience, but you just can't put it into a darn scene, you make it a sequel.
Yeah.
So that's emotion. We all go through emotion, and then once we've had our emotion, then we start thinking about stuff.
So this is stage 2.
Thought.
And of course, just like emotion, there are 3 levels that your character will go through. A 3-part pattern. The first one is review. What do you think he meant by review?
What just happened? In the example he gives in his appendix, this woman has fallen through the floor of a cavern and has landed. But my guess is that scene ended with her falling. And then the review is remembering, how she felt when she was falling.
Okay.
Or how she thought about it. That allows you to do a cliffhanger or something and to follow up right away with kind of the aftermath.
Okay, so a review is them just kind of replaying important things that have happened.
Yeah.
And like filtering it through their thought process.
So review is, let's talk about what happened. Analysis is, let's talk about why it happened. And planning is, let's talk about why I'm going to do the next thing.
Right.
And he put a lot of time into planning because he says often you as the writer know what you want your character to do next. But if you don't spend enough time planning, explaining why they're going to take this next step, then your audience isn't going to be on board. So in his example of the woman that fell into the cavern, by all accounts, she should stay put and wait for someone to find her. And so what he did was he rehashed all the reasons why someone wouldn't find her. And if you look at the actual thing that's going on, it really does look like a conflict that she's going through all the evolving reasons why she should do it before she does the next thing. I think there's definitely some overlap between the techniques used in scenes and the techniques used in sequels.
Right.
I was thinking I would pick something for reading now to kind of give an example of this sort of thought process.
Yeah, both the emotion and the thought.
Yes, although I'm picking one of my favorite listening series, Murderbot, and since Murderbot is not a person, it does not necessarily have emotions the same way. But
Who's it by again?
This is by Martha Wells, and this is from her first book, All Systems Red. And it starts off, as many scenes in Murderbot starts off, after Murderbot has been knocked unconscious, all its systems have gone offline, and it's figuring out what's going on.
Rebooting.
Kind of. I came back online to no vision, no hearing, no ability to move. I couldn't reach the feed or the comm. Not good, Murderbot. Not good. So that's kind of a review. I got some weird flashes of sensations all from my organic parts, air on my face, my arms, through the rips in my suit, on the burning wound on my shoulder. So there we got a bit of
Emotion.
emotion and told through example.
Told through example, yes.
I'm skipping some little parts here. The sensations were only for a second at a time. It was confusing and I wanted to scream. Maybe this is how murderbots die. You lose function, go offline, but parts of you keep working. Organic pieces kept alive by fading energy in your power cells. Then I knew someone was moving me and I really wanted to scream.
Oh, wow, that's all emotion.
Yeah.
Wow.
Then my organic parts started to sting. Numbness was wearing off. I was designed to work with both organic and machine parts to balance that sensory input. Without that balance, I felt like a balloon floating midair, but the organic part of my chest was in contact with the hard surface, and that abruptly brought my position into focus. I was lying face down, one arm dangling. They put me on a table? This was definitely not good. It goes on like that, but you can see this is all the stuff in its head as it's thinking about things, and it mixes and matches. Like sometimes it's emotion, sometimes it's analysis.
So you would call that analysis, because I was thinking that whole thing was emotion.
I think that it was analysis in that we were getting information about where it was and what had happened previously.
I see.
But yeah, you're right. It was more emotion.
Well, right, because there was no planning. Did he review what happened?
No, not exactly.
Maybe I'm just not seeing it. I just see emotion there. You know, I have another example.
Okay, let's do that.
This one everyone knows. It is Angelus Ashes by Frank McCourt. What happened was the mother goes up to Frank and says, "You're going to take dancing classes." And Frank's like, "I don't want to take Irish dancing classes. This is dumb," because he's a boy. And he doesn't want to do that kind of thing, right? Not to say that boys don't dance, but Frank doesn't want to dance. But his mom's like, "You got to do it. Your ancestors did it. This is cultural. Damn it. Get in the car." Well, they didn't have cars back then.
The setup is Frank was in a scene where he was being forced to dance.
He was forced to take dancing classes.
Okay,
So they show up on the first day. And he says, "If my pals see my mother dragging me through the streets to an Irish dancing class, I'll be disgraced entirely. They think it's all right to dance and pretend you're Fred Astaire because you can jump all over the screen with Ginger Rogers. There is no Ginger Rogers in Irish dancing, and you can't jump all over. You stand straight up and down and keep your arms against yourself and kick your legs up and around and never smile. My Uncle Paul Keating said Irish dancers look like they have steel rods up their arses, but I can't say that to Mam. She'd kill me." To me, that is both emotion, but then also thought. Because he's reviewing, if my pals see me dragging through the streets to Irish dancing class. So he's reviewing the scene of his mother saying he has to go to Irish dancing class.
Right, and there's analysis in there too.
It goes into, might look good on the screen, but that's not the kind of dancing that looks cool. And then planning. Is there a plan? Not yet, but it could be in the next paragraph. But no, he goes straight into scene. So I've read this book, and I've seen the movie, and the scene is essentially leading up to him actually making a decision. He decides to just take the money and pretend he knows how to dance. It could be that the thought process got pushed. So the next couple pages are mostly just a detailed summary of what it's like in the first and second class, but not too much detail. Like, it's not on stage. It is summary.
It is summarized, which is the thing you're not allowed to do in a scene.
Right. So essentially what he's doing is he's still analyzing, even though the situation is playing out. Well, then something new happens. Ma'am says Fred Astaire went to his lessons every Saturday, and I didn't go around kicking the toes out of his boots. And if I wanted to be like him, I'd have to go to Mrs. O'Connor's every week. The fourth Saturday morning, Billy Campbell, which is his friend, Billy Campbell knocks at our door. Mrs. Court, can Frankie come out and play? Ma'am tells him, no, Billy, Frankie is going to his dancing lesson. He waits for me at the bottom of Barrack Hill. And then there's a description of Barrack Hill and playing soccer. And then Frankie says, I tell him I'm finished with the dancing, that I have 6 pence in my pocket for Mrs. O'Connor that's supposed to go into the coffers, that I'm going to the Lyric Cinema instead. 6 pence will get the two of us in with 2 pence left over for 2 squares of Cleve's toffee, and we have a great time looking at Riders of the Purple Sage. So, there's his plan. He decides he's going to take the money instead of giving it to the lady who runs the dancing, and he's going to go to the movies with his friend.
What could possibly go wrong with that?
Oh, he'll never get caught. Actually, it's a really good scene in the movie, too, at the end. All right, so it looks like it sort of does play out. Sometimes things get pushed between time or summary happens in between these 3 steps, but it looks like, at least in the descriptions that we've seen, that they do these things, that there is an emotion and that there are review, analysis, and planning, although the planning can get a little tricky.
It looked like this one actually went through the thought, and then it did a whole bunch of summarizing of stuff, and then it jumped finally to the planning.
Yeah, it's not a formula.
So Bickham says for decision, you must make the new goal clear, which feels to me a little bit like defeating the point of when you have a scene and you have to make the goal clear, because aren't you just repeating it twice? Because I disagreed with this, I looked very carefully at his justifications. So part of it is strategic. Basically, you need to have a decision because it justifies why you even had the sequel. Why go through the emotional response, the analytical response, if it doesn't result in a goal of how to move forward? And then tactical, which is that it sets up for the next scene. It gets us ready to see, or it gets excited for the next scene. And then finally it lays the groundwork for the scene goal that's to come. So I was thinking that if you technically have a decision that sets up a goal and then you go into some action, if that isn't basically the same as a scene where you've got your goal and then the resulting action.
It could play out that way where the decision comes out in a scene.
Yeah, or I think that he was setting up, like, say, person in a haunted house, super scared. You come up with a reason why for them to move forward. They make the decision they're going to keep going. The action is they reach for the doorknob and open the door. And then your scene starts immediately afterwards with them walking through the door. So you could have a very minor action. You could have something that's so short you don't even want to call it a scene, and it's tucked at the end of the sequel. But at the same time, you could expand on that. Like if, say, someone makes a decision, they've decided that they need to do this thing and they need to contact. And then you have a series of phone calls that are unsuccessful, that as opposed to telling them in the moment, you summarize until they get to like the person that's important for them to call. Let's move on to the variations. Let's say you have a cliffhanger. He gives the example of someone who, in the end of the scene, he's looking for this gun and the guy pulls that gun on him and says he's going to shoot him. Obviously, you don't have time to expand on what he's thinking at that point because the next scene's going to start with him getting shot or avoiding the gun or whatever. But the audience will be aware that the sequel didn't happen. He's saying often you might go back later in a bit quieter time where the character remembers what happened, either in a discussion or in his own head or whatever. That moment that guy pulled out the gun and I was thinking yada, 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 or my heartbeat went yada, yada, yada.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Bickham says that readers have been essentially trained through reading to expect these sequels. Made me think again of my composition class where I tell beginning college writers, hey, you know, you're writing for the academy here and we're all trained readers here. And when we're reading an argument, we demand evidence. We've been trained to look for it and to poke holes in arguments that don't have it.
And that's the critique group comment. I didn't feel the emotion here. I didn't understand why this was happening. You need to go more than just telling us what happens, but actually getting into it. It's the power that a novel has. It's the reason why it's not real life. We actually get to figure out why that asshole did that thing.
The story of my life.
Which can occupy an incredible amount of time after you've encountered the asshole as you try to work it out. But in a novel, you have the satisfaction of why.
Right.
Or what happened next. Or, yeah.
So this chapter, dear listener, this chapter made me feel like I was in a hurricane. It made me feel like I was in one of those crazy decision trees that were so complex and so intricate that I don't even know.
I wanted to highlight one other thing that I like. In that example you were reading, you discussed how there was basically a couple of paragraphs devoted to what his first and second lessons were, told in summary, so not as a scene. So he says, some novelists, for example, are more interested in their characters' reactions to events than the events themselves. We can find great chunks of a novel composed almost entirely of sequels to scenes that were skipped over. Basically, you're writing stuff in summary. You're writing your scenes in summary, and you're including emotions and analysis and all that stuff with it. You're jumping over slow parts, you're emphasizing. And then, I love this line, this is why I like it. This is a highly complex and specialized technique, and I don't recommend it. For the writer capable of handling it, however, it provides some advantages. And then it talks about the various things that you can do. You can condense, you can be more subjective, more interpretation, you can slow down something to really nail it. Bickham's basically saying, well, you can go and try that, but...
But good luck, sucker. You know, it made me think of high school teachers making their students write 5-paragraph essays. And it's them saying, well, you could write something more complex, but you might confuse the reader. It's condescending.
It is, and yet Bickham's point is that particular technique works when you already know how to write your scenes. And you already know what's in those scenes. And you have constructed those scenes with a goal, a conflict, and a disaster. And if you just jump to the summarizing, you might not be including all the parts that are necessary for a scene. Because face it, how many times are you in a critique group where someone is just summarizing and people say, I really would love to have seen this in a scene with dialogue. I really would want to have actually gone through the process of them walking to the store and purchasing this or whatever else, because it's been written in summary. So what I got out of this is that this is an available technique, and you will almost certainly have to use it in your novel at some point, but you better know how to write your scenes first.
Okay, so getting an MFA, going through that process, they do not teach this kind of guideline stuff. They'll teach you what's a scene, you know, they'll give you examples, but most, at least in my program, and also getting my creative writing degree at UCSC, it was based on reading. We weren't reading craft books. We were reading books. We were reading the thing we were trying to write. And we didn't have discussions about, well, you know, is there a sequel in here? Is there a scene? We would talk about conflict, but we were talking at it in a more like organic way and our reactions as readers, but not so much these very seemingly rigid guidelines. In English 1A, you know, critical thinking, that kind of stuff, sure. But I'm talking creative writing. I feel like it's being reduced down to something that can be easily analyzed when it is not easy to analyze a story because there's a lot of parts.
You're doing an MFA, a Master's in Fine Arts. You are not doing a Master in Genre.
So, okay, so we maybe need to reinforce that this is a page turner. He's focusing on genre fiction.
An MFA, it's not meant to do cookie cutters and to push out someone that can write.
Right.
They were pushing you to do more. And they weren't going to do the bullet pointing, do this, this, and this.
So there's a part of me that wants to just keep into that camp. I want to stay there. I'm like, no, this is too much. It's going to stifle creativity. And you're reducing the magic of creativity to these bullet points. But then there's a part of me that's like, Renee, aren't you sitting there at the computer, like trying to figure out what to write next? And things aren't coming together and you can't figure it out. I'm very mean to myself. It's like I want to believe in this stuff because I feel it's giving me this lifeline that I need. But then there's another part of me that's fighting it.
Now, in contrast, in my program, we talked about that kind of stuff all the time.
Really?
We did one where we were doing feature writing, longer articles. The professor put together a collection of articles, and we went through everyone and said, what's the opening paragraph? How did they do the opening? What's the nut graph where they're describing what they're talking about? How did they set up the ending? And we analyzed all of them to look at all the different techniques. They taught us how to do all these things, with the idea being that once you had those set of skills, then you could do more. Like, there are feature writing pieces that break all the rules and go beyond any of the stuff we were learning. But the instructor, so what happened in the class was he was giving all these, then he was showing us some of the really amazing features. And one of the persons like, but I want to know how to write that. And he said, I can't teach you how to write that level. I can teach you how to write this level. And by writing at this level, you will push yourself to that level. So this isn't going to teach you how to write your memoir, Renee, but this is going to teach you some of the structural elements that as you write, you can go beyond. I don't think that I'd particularly enjoy a book that was written purely to Bickham's specifications.
All right, so Renee had her existential crisis. Kim brought in the big guns, i.e. logic and sound thinking. And so this was a lot of information. It will be broken down into some chapter notes for you, dear listener. I will try to make sense of it for you, for myself. And do we have another example? You said that you had another example.
Oh, yeah. This is The Magicians by Lev Grossman. And this scene takes place after Quentin has proved himself that he's worthy of entering the Magic Academy.
To those who've not read this book, it's kind of like
Grown-up Harry Potter.
Hipster Harry Potter.
Yeah. Afterwards, Quentin couldn't remember much of the rest of the night except that he spent it there in the school. He was exhausted and weak, like he'd been drugged. His chest felt hollow and empty. He wasn't even hungry anymore, just desperate to sleep. It was embarrassing, but no one seemed to mind. So that's a lot of emotion right there. Professor Van de Veeg told him it was perfectly natural to be tired because he had just cast his first minor incantation, whatever that was, and it would wear anybody out. So that's a bit of summary of what was happening before. The next morning, it took him a long, confused minute to figure out where he was. He lay in bed, slowly piecing together his memories of the day before. It was Friday, and by rights he should be in school now. Instead, he was waking up in an unfamiliar bedroom wearing yesterday's clothes. He felt vaguely confused and regretful.
That's the transition.
Mm-hmm. Like he'd drunk too much at a party with people he didn't know very well and fallen asleep in the host's spare bedroom. He even had a trace of what felt like a hangover. So that's kind of like a summary there. Here's an analysis. What exactly had happened last night? What had he done? His memories were all wrong. The events were like a dream. They had to be, but they didn't feel like a dream. And this room wasn't a dream. A crow cawed outside loudly and immediately stopped, as if it were embarrassed. There was no other sound. So there's some analysis. And then we get some description of the room. He had to admit it was a highly satisfactory room. No danger signs yet. Maybe this wasn't a complete disaster. At any rate, it was time to get up, time to get it over with, and find out what was going on. So that's a bit of like planning and kind of a goal. He got up and padded over to the window. The stone floor was cool on his bare feet. It was early, misty dawn, and he was very high up, higher than the tops of the highest trees. He had slept for 10 hours. He looked down on the green lawn. It was silent and empty. He saw the crow. It drifted by before him on glossy blue-black wings.
Action.
Yeah, or something. He does actually get up and walk to the window.
Gets up. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't explicitly state a goal. We're leaving him just looking out the window as opposed to like him going to the room to go find so-and-so and confront him.
Right. I mean, on a extremely basic level, one could argue that he does have a goal. It's to get up. But that's almost petty.
Or to move forward with this new life. That is definitely a sequel right there.
Oh, yeah.
But it's not so obvious as Bickham demands. Bickham says that it's harder to find sequels in books because of the editing. A scene is obvious. It starts with, this is the location. Someone is doing this. These are the characters. This is where the camera is. A sequel is more nebulous.
It's hard to find in a book. Well, if it's so hard to find in a book, then I don't know. I saw with what you just read. It was in there. Mm-hmm. It's the meat between the scenes. But did it have everything? Maybe.
And it flowed so well that somebody reading it wouldn't necessarily say, oh, this is a sequel. It's more like this is a continuation of the scene and building up to the next and just kind of this neat stuff that's happening. And I get a chance to look at what this Hogwarts looks like.
Here's a strategy. This is maybe how I'll take this. When I'm writing and my scene is over, I'm going to ask myself, what the heck do I do now? And I'm going to go to this chapter and I'm going to do like, okay, I need to include some of these things.
Bickham actually says, Only after study of the excerpt works on sequel planning of your own will you be ready to move on to the next chapter of this book. So, we need to do some exercises. Bickham gives more than one option for extra work, and one of them is working through some sample workbook disasters.
So the first workbook disaster. A man very much in love with his wife learns that she is having a long-term, passionate affair. Instead of being hurt or outraged and confronting her or her lover, can you devise reactions and thoughts which would instead convince him to feel relief and decide to buy her a nice present while saying nothing?
So the idea is you really need the sequel here because it doesn't make sense what the person would be doing next if you didn't have that sequel. I think to make these work, you kind of do need all the parts of a Jack Bickham sequel.
Right. He does say to write a predictable sequel pattern and resulting new decision. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the decision has to be predictable.
So predictable in the way he
Have
set it
all
up.
of the pieces.
Start with the emotion, go to the thought, come up with a new decision.
No, action and then decision.
No, decision then action.
Decision and then action to go. Yes.
Okay.
All right. Das ist das.
Das ist das.
So we're back to the activity portion of the podcast.
Let's actually start off with how did this go for you?
This has been a very interesting exercise because I'm technically not writing fiction. I am writing memoir. And there are many different types of creative nonfiction and how it can be shaped. I don't know if it actually falls into this shape. It can. If it's written like a novel, it can. But mine tends to be more essay-like than it is chapters. But there are scenes. So it did kind of work. It was kind of a weird sort of. I don't know, but how about you, Kim? How did it work out for you?
For me, it worked really well. My novel is clearly genre fiction. It's clearly page turner, and it is made up of scenes. So once I got my approach, it was fine. But I had a hard time coming up with just brand new scenes off the top of my head because I'm a discovery writer, which means I'm not quite sure the particulars until I get down to writing it. And just simply doing an outline gets very dry for me, and it doesn't really engage me. So I purposely leave off all the little twists and turns until I'm writing a scene. However, I had an entire chapter I got kind of a rough version on, which was working more or less and was composed of a bunch of scenes. So I went through that chapter and identified all the scenes. And it was interesting what came about when I tried to match the scenes there with what Bickham expected from a scene.
So you used this more as a revision tactic other than like a prepare to write a scene process.
Right. I got to one place where I hadn't written anything down. It was very nebulous, and I realized I didn't know what to do for my twists for that scene. And I really won't know what to do with this twist until I come up with a rough draft, and then I'll be able to dig in and use this technique to really identify what those 4 twists are.
That's interesting. So in the chapter, Bickham was specifically saying, do this before you write your chapter. But it looks like it's applicable in both ways. That the terms are outliner versus discovery writer. So you're a discovery writer.
Yes. So I could not come up with these off the top of my head. I can come up with big things up the top of my head, but this is really drilling down to the minuscule of a scene. Some of the twists are tiny twists, and I just can't come up with those until I'm right in the middle of that scene and feeling how it goes.
Right. It's more organic for you.
Yeah.
What was the stuff you ended up changing according to these cards?
I'm going to focus on the final scene in this chapter. I actually read the first scene for our bonus podcast last week, the one where the militia guard needs to train the incoming hero to be a fighter. And we went through that and looked at how it matched Bickham's scene. And as this chapter progresses, it's all about taking these people from our world that have been plopped into a fantasy world and need to become heroes. And they've been assigned classes. It's all about them learning how to fit these classes. So after the scene where one character learns how to be a fighter, then we have a scene where one character learns how to be a ranger, and then one character learns how to be a cleric, and finally we get to the character that's a rogue and how he learns to be a rogue. And it made perfect sense for the first three because I'd already created characters from that world that were a fighter, a ranger, and a cleric. But the problem was there aren't any rogues in the story so far. And this is something I thought of a while back when I was thinking of the scene. I was thinking, who the heck is going to train Cole the rogue? And then I realized I already had the character I needed. It's going to be the raccoon.
Is there a raccoon?
There's a raccoon, yeah. The ranger has a beast companion that's a raccoon.
Does he talk? Kind of like...
He doesn't talk at all.
Okay.
You know, if there's an archetype to train a rogue, I would think that a raccoon would fit the bill.
It's a smart raccoon.
Right. So the scene was going to play out where the raccoon came to Cole the rogue and convinced him to follow the raccoon. And he was going to take him to a human that was a thief that would train him more specifically. It wasn't like the raccoon was going to teach him lockpicking skills or anything like that. But the raccoon would know who to hook him up with.
I'm a little disappointed. I kind of want the raccoon to do it.
Anyway, so the scene was to be the raccoon contacts the rogue, convinces him that he can help the rogue, leads him to this thief, and then the thief would further train the rogue. And I was thinking it would all be one scene, because if the scene goal is, will the raccoon Cornelius train Cole, then it was all the way through. But I realized that once Cole gets to this thief to train him, Cornelius' scene is over for the understanding we have of what the scene goal is. So the scene goal was Cornelius must convince Cole to trust him so that Cornelius can help Cole become a rogue. And the scene ends when Cole is following Cornelius because he trusts him.
I see.
So that was the first thing I realized, is that your scenes may be shorter than you think they are. In order to get that immediacy, in order to get that finality, you may have several scenes within a period where things are happening linearly and there's no breaks.
Did it end in a disaster?
Yeah, so let's keep going on this. So you have to come up with 4 twists.
Mm-hmm.
I have to question, was it hard for you to come up with 4 twists for your scenes?
Yes. Because some of them, like you said, are so short. There's not a lot of exchange. It's like, it's just a line of dialogue. There can't be more twists because there's no more dialogue.
Right, and this is an advantage that I have. And I did make 4 twists per scene. This caused me to reevaluate how my characters interacted.
Mm-hmm.
I realized I needed to have an element of conflict in each of the interactions because the original writing of the scene has very little of Cole rejecting the raccoon. It's much more of they meet up and very soon Cole, the rogue, realizes that the raccoon's there to help him. But that didn't actually have much tension to it. So I had to come up with some various things. And so the first twist was that Cornelius gets distracted by a thought and suddenly he doesn't know where Cole is. So he had to chase him down. And then the next one is that when Cornelius shows up, initially Cole doesn't trust him at all. And so there's a conflict right there. Cornelius has to work to gain Cole's trust, or has to manipulate the situation to get Cole to pay attention to him. And then in twist number 3 is when Cornelius actually gets Cole to trust him. He uses his really cute raccoon face on him with really big eyes.
Aww.
And then finally, the final bit is very easy. Cornelius just needs to get Cole to follow him. So he runs along a little bit and looks back at Cole.
Mm-hmm.
And then Cole starts to follow him. And then the disaster is the final line, which I was including anyway. It wasn't in the middle of the scene because I assumed this was a much longer scene, and it became the final line, which is that, yes, Cornelia gets Cole to follow him, but Cole tells him, don't let anyone know I got help from a raccoon.
He's got to save some face.
Exactly. What I found was really interesting was by forcing me to put these twists in, I actually revealed a lot more of the characters than I had originally. By having Cole not trust Cornelius, I actually got more into Cole's personality and why he, well, not why he wouldn't trust a raccoon, but why he would be distrustful of everything going on around him.
Right.
So yeah, that was my exercise. And I got 6 cards out of the chapter. So I did my half dozen.
So there's 6 scenes then in that chapter.
There ended up being 6 scenes, yeah.
If you turn this in as an assignment, do you think that you followed the exercise as intended?
Given that I can't come up with these things off the top of my head, yes. Because I really looked at each of the scenes and I identified those points. When you're doing it on note cards, you can't do as much hand waving, Like in our other exercises where we were analyzing our various scenes, it was easy to kind of say, oh yeah, and this sort of happens here, and the prose would carry it along. But when you're actually writing it on note cards, it has to be a twist. It has to be, who are the two people in conflict?
So are you going to keep this method? Is this going to be part of your revision process now?
It'll be in my toolbox. This worked well because there was a series of short scenes. My next chapter is going to be largely between two characters in a situation where there's more conversing. So I don't know if it's going to work out for that or not.
Wouldn't that be called a scene though?
Right, but if it's a long chapter, I think I might run into problems that I don't quite have the back and forth or the plot twists to fill it up. Actually, here's the thing. In these ones, I had a whole bunch of external action, and I'm not sure if I'm going to have as much external action or more internal exposition in the next scene.
I see.
In the next chapter.
So this is mostly a success.
I would definitely say this was a success.
If somebody's debating whether or not they should be trying this note card strategy, who do you think would most benefit?
That's a really good question. I think any action scene or any scene where your character's moving through stuff, this is a big help because it breaks it down to a series of steps and it makes you come up with what the conflict is at each of those steps, because it's too easy, especially when you're writing your first draft, to just want to get your characters from point A to point B and just to explain how things go, and you want things to be working out well. But to approach your scene and say, no, where is the conflict here? How do I end this scene where the character doesn't get everything that they want, is very different than how do I get my character to do this thing.
Yeah. Cool.
The other thing that works really well too is, since everything has to be external, each of my twists had to come from something external happening. Like my twist number 1, that Cornelia gets distracted. Initially wasn't going to have him be distracted. I was going to have him come meet Cole right away and start the scene. But I wanted Cornelius to be thinking about certain things. I wanted to get the right timing for him to show up and meet up with Cole. And so I needed to introduce this distraction and losing Cole just to get my twists in, but also it makes the scene more dynamic.
So it seems like this was kind of a success in various different ways.
Definitely was a success.
Excellent.
And we will talk about yours in our bonus podcast.
Yes. So, dear listener, if you would like more, please come to Patreon, and there you can get the bonus episode. And for this episode, it will be me talking about my process using these note cards for memoir. You'll also get very thorough chapter notes and broken down examples to help you do these activities on your own and to understand the concepts of Bickham. We've also got activities on there for you to do. You can do the activity and post it, and the first 3 that post will get feedback from me and Kim. We also have some polls, and we have some community posts that you can make. So head over onto Patreon and support your local creator or local maker or whoever we are.
Fantastic. All right, listeners, see you in 2 weeks.
See you in 2 weeks.
Words to Write By is produced by Renee Nelson and Kim Smiga-Otto. Our theme music is Roll Back the Carpet by Cool Cat Music. Have a great day.
I've been writing all the words.
All the words.
That was actually pretty good. My teacher brain went on.